Hello, welcome to a new unit, a new topic. We are going to look at conflict in the Middle East and the U.S.'s role in that region when it comes to conflict. I think you all know, if you pay attention to current events, the U.S. has had a couple of wars there. In my lifetime, there's been 3 wars in the Middle East that we've been in. We're also involved with helping countries. We have allies, we have enemies. Um, so, let's figure out what's going on there. Why does the Middle East seem to be so violent? You don't see this kind of violence in Latin America or Asia or Europe or Africa. So, why are we going to wars in the Middle East? Why is terrorism coming out of the Middle East? And what should the U.S. be doing over there? That's going to be our big question. Now, keep in mind, as I say that the Middle East has all this conflict, in the 20th century, if we looked at a region that had all the conflict, it would be Europe. So Europe had World War I, World War II, the Cold War. So we got to keep in mind that it hasn't always been the Middle East that's been the place with the conflict. Europe had tons of conflict in the 20th century. Okay, let's pull up the presentation. We're looking at U.S. and the Middle East. There's going to be 4 parts to the screencast. This is going to be part 1. And in part 1, we're going to cover the fall of the Ottoman Empire, colonial powers, World War I and World War II, conflicting promises that were made during those times, oil nationalism, and the birth of Israel. All right, let's jump in. Essential questions. This is what we're going to have our big discussion at the end of the screencast. And in a couple of lessons, we're going to discuss these questions. Which interests and values should provide the basis for U.S. policy in the region? Oops, forgot a question mark there. How should the Middle East enormous oil reserves and the United States' close relationship with Israel figure into policy calculations? And how do recent changes from the Arab Spring and beyond affect U.S. relationships with countries in the region? Okay, let's see. First thing we need to know about the region is that it's the home to 3 ancient religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all started in the Middle East. And so that is something that is unique about this region. And you can see this map where the religions are today. Let's bring it forward, though, to the Ottoman Empire. This is an empire that ruled the Middle East for several hundred years. And in 1900, this is about what the map looked like. This is 1914, right before World War I. The Ottoman Empire was based out of Turkey. It controlled Iraq, controlled parts of Syria, Lebanon, down the coast of Saudi Arabia, and parts of Libya. So it's a huge empire, and it united the region. However, that was about to come to an end. The Ottoman Empire was getting weaker, and it was falling apart, and a lot of Arab countries wanted the power to rule themselves, and that was called self-determination. And the Arab countries had this, in the United States president, Woodrow Wilson, he was advocating for self-determination for countries all over the world that were colonized. Woodrow Wilson was out there saying, hey, there should be self-determination. Colonized countries should be able to get their power back and take care of themselves. And the Arab countries thought that was a good idea. It didn't work out, though. After World War I, Britain and France carved up the Middle East, the old Ottoman Empire. This is how they split it up. You can see France has Syria and Lebanon, and Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. The British have Egypt, the Sudan, Palestine, which is current day Israel and Jordan. They had Iraq, and they had all along the coast of Saudi Arabia. That's Oman, United Arab Emirates, Yemen. So the colonial powers carved up the Ottoman Empire. And if you can imagine, a lot of people in the Middle East were not very fond of being colonized. During World War One, the British made some deals with some people. The British were the major world power at the time. They were the superpower. They had colonies all over the world. And they made a deal with some Jewish people that were living in the Middle East and that were in Europe. And the deal they made was called the Balfour Declaration, was that Britain would help establish a country for Jewish people in Palestine, which is modern day Israel. It was called Palestine back then. So the British make that deal. They also make a deal with a leader in Saudi Arabia named Sharif Hussein. And with this deal, it was a leader between the ruler of Mecca, which is a city in Saudi Arabia, a very important city, and the British. And the British said they would help him create independent Arab countries all across Arab lands, including Palestine, if Sharif helps the British defeat the Ottoman Empire, which he ended up doing. He did help them. So the British are making these conflicting promises, and that's going to come back to be a problem in a couple of decades. In the 1930s, oil is really being discovered, and the oil industry is taking off in the Middle East. So the Allied powers are worried that Germany and Japan, in the 1930s, Germany and Japan are building these big industrial economies and these big, massive armies and navies and air forces. And everybody knew they were going to need a lot of fuel. And so the Allied powers, Britain, France, United States, started getting worried that they would have access to all this Middle East oil. So the United States and Britain are trying to become allies with Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait and Iran to prevent Germany and Japan from getting the oil. During World War II, the gray countries are neutral, so Turkey and Saudi Arabia were neutral. These green countries were allies with Great Britain, France, and the U.S. So that includes Greece and Tunisia over here. And the yellow countries were allied with Germany and Italy and the Axis powers. So you can see how things split up. After World War II, there got to be a feeling in the Middle East called nationalism. This was love for one's country. Sometimes nationalism can be good if it's a little bit of love for one's country. Sometimes it can be excessive, where nationalism means that you dislike foreigners and you don't trust foreigners and you're angry with foreigners. So a little nationalism can be okay, though. It's on the rise after World War II, and what happens in the Middle East is that there were kings in charge of a lot of countries, and the nationalist movement overthrew the kings, and they put leaders in that were no longer monarchies. Several of these leaders tried to unite the entire Arab region, and that movement was called Pan-Arabism. It never really worked out, though, because the Arab countries are distinct and have different cultures and different groups of people. So uniting them proved to be too hard, although that was something that was attempted. And the idea was that if they all unite, they would be a world power, but they could never get it to happen. In 1948, remember the British promised the Jewish people that they could have a country. Well, the Jewish people start moving to Palestine, and from 1922 to 1939, the population of Jewish people in Palestine grows immensely. This whole area was called Palestine back then. Nowadays, this part is called Jordan, and this part is Israel. So a huge influx of Jewish people to the region. A lot of them are moving from Europe because, remember, this is when the Nazis are on the rise, and so Jewish people are leaving Europe. They became about a third of the population. Now, that just sounds fine. Hey, let's go have a country somewhere where we won't be harassed by Nazis. And a lot of people thought that was a great idea, except for the people who were living here, the Palestinians. They didn't really like all of these people moving into their land, and so there started to be conflict between the Jews and the Palestinians. The British end up not wanting to make a decision. about creating a country for the Jewish people. So they leave it up to the United Nations, and the United Nations decides in 1948 to create the country of Israel. This is going to be super important because for the next 70 years, from 48 to today, Israel is one of our closest allies in the region. So when they're created, both the United States and the Soviet Union, the two world superpowers, they recognize Israel. And recognize means you acknowledge that they are a legitimate country. If you are a group of people somewhere in the world and you say, hey, we want to be a country, you're not just a country unless other countries recognize you, unless the powers of the world recognize you. So it's a big deal that the US and the Soviet Union both recognize Israel's right to exist. However, the US, there were a lot of people that were hesitant to support Israel. They feared there would be an Arab backlash. A lot of the Arab people did not want to have a Jewish country in their lands. So they were opposed to the creation of Israel. So some U.S. officials said we shouldn't support Israel. They were worried about our oil supply. Hey, if we're friends with Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait, but if they don't like Israel, maybe they will cut off our oil. They were also worried that if we made the Arab countries mad, they would become allies of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was our enemy at the time. We did not want to help them get allies. We did not want to lose allies to the Soviet Union. But we went ahead and supported them, even though the people were hesitant. When Israel is created, the Arab countries all refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. So all of the neighbors of Israel thought that Israel should not be a country. Immediately, there's a war. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq all invade Israel. The war only lasts for like a year because it turns out Israel had stockpiled a lot of weapons and had trained a military, and they were really well equipped. And so the Israelis were able to fight off all of the Arab armies. And this map shows kind of these red arrows are where Israel's getting attacked from. And this border, see the blue border? That was the original border of Israel. So it wasn't shaped like it is today. All this other land in here, this was saved for the Palestinians. But when Israel wins the war, they're able to negotiate and get a little bit more of this land for themselves. So the U.S. interest in the region at the end of this period, we were interested in getting oil, we were interested in being friends with Israel, and we were interested in preventing the advancement and influence of the Soviet Union. We did not want communism to spread anywhere else in the world. All right, that's it for this part. Tune in for part 2. And if you have any questions, email me or see me in class. Bye-bye.